Good morning. One of the things that I've always, if you will, envied about those who grew up in Israel is that so much of our literature is in their first language. And I remember a couple of years ago, I was at a Shabbos table in Yerushalayim, and there was a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who was sharing a Dvar Torah for the Parsha. So she took out a Chumash Mikros Kedolos, and she read the Pasuk and the Ramban and the Ben Ezra. Just read it without translating because she just read what it says and everybody understands. And then she went on to share whatever her thought was. So, how the language is such a gift that people who grow up there have. So, many years ago, I was about 15 years ago or so, probably the last time Purim fell on a Friday. I was in yeshiva in Kfar Chabad, and I used to have a Mitzvayim route. I would go every Friday to put on tefillin with people in Tel Aviv, and I had a whole area where I would go from store to store. And so Purim was on Friday, and obviously it's every Purim is a rush to try. Putting on tefillin takes 2 minutes. Learning the Megillah takes a lot longer, and it's Friday. You have to get back to yeshiva for Shabbos. So there was this area where there was maybe 5 stores I used to go to that were all around, and each store is a few people, and it was around this sort of square or garden of sorts. And I got so we arranged everybody would come out to this center of the square, and I would read the Megillah there for everyone together. So before I started, I apologized that I'm not in a position to read the Megillah in Ivrit with the Sephardi pronunciation, which is the way most Israelis are used to hearing it. And I said, halachically, whichever pronunciation you use is perfectly valid, but you have to be consistent. So for me to be able to read the Megillah, certainly at high speed and perhaps even regular, but to be able to read the Megillah in Sephardi pronunciation without making any mistakes was going to be quite the challenge. So I apologize. I'm not going to be able to do this. I said I'm going to do it in Ashkenazi pronunciation. Bear with me. So I'm sitting there reading the Megillah, and as fast as I possibly can, and articulating each word clearly. And about 2/3 of the way through, this 10-year-old girl who's like sitting like this, staring at me, and she pipes up, I don't understand anything you're saying. Right? And it like struck how here's a 10-year-old girl who's used to go, she's not religious, but in Israel, many people celebrate Purim. And she's used to going to shul on wherever she goes on Purim and hearing the story of Purim. And here she's coming and this guy is talking gibberish, right? If you ever try to hear somebody talking English with a Scottish accent, you know what I'm talking about. So why can't we do the same? Can we read the Megillah in English? And before I start, I want to thank my friend Rabbi Shraga Hamnik. I often get ideas or sources from him, but in this case, practically, he actually gave a class on this topic last week, and I listened to his class, and then I discussed with him. We shared some ideas and sources, but this class would not be here without him, so giving him the mention. Okay, so the Mishnah says like this. This is the first Mishnah of the second chapter of Megillah. So somebody who reads the Megillah out of sequence does not fulfill his obligation. By the way, that is familiar to all of us from the famous Vart of the Baal Shem Tov, which we talk about every year, that when we read the story of Purim, we shouldn't just be reading it as history, but we have to find the practical relevance, not to read it l'mafreya, which literally translates as out of sequence, but also not to read it l'mafreya as being, actually literally l'mafreya means backward or in the past. So don't read the Megillah in hindsight. Read it with foresight, so to speak. Okay. If you read it by heart, or if he read it in Targum or in any other language, he has not fulfilled his obligation. So if I take the Megillah that's written by Hebrew Me'achashverosh, written in Hebrew, and I either read it by heart, so I didn't have the scroll in front of me looking at the words, or I'm looking at the Hebrew words and I'm saying in another language. I'm saying, and it was in the days of Achashverosh, right? So then I'm not fulfilled the obligation. However, we may read it for those who speak a foreign language in a foreign language. I may read the Megillah to somebody in any other language, let's say English, if it's written, for those who speak a foreign language, if it's written in a foreign language, meaning if it's written in a foreign language. So I can't read from the Hebrew Megillah translating it into English, but if I have Megillah written in English, then I would be able to read it. One who speaks a but one who speaks a foreign language, one who speaks a foreign language and heard it read in Hebrew, that was written in Syrian script, we won't get into that, has fulfilled his obligation, right? So this last part of the Mishnah is the way we do the mitzvah in practice nowadays, that even somebody who speaks, let's say, exclusively a foreign language, or somebody who doesn't know any Hebrew, nevertheless, if you sit in shul and you hear the entire Megillah read in Hebrew and don't understand a single word, you fulfill your obligation, right? So that's the way we do it today. We read it in Hebrew, and many people come to shul who don't know anything, who don't know what we're talking about, and they still do it, and they still fulfill the mitzvah. But the Mishnah does say clearly that you can read it in a foreign language for people who don't understand that language. So wouldn't it be a much better idea for us to read the Megillah in English, in French, in Spanish, whatever the local tongue is? Would be much more meaningful experience for many people. Now the Gemara asks, why would it be? Why should that be the case? Why should somebody who doesn't understand Hebrew fulfill his obligation by hearing it in Hebrew? What point is there? So the Gemara says like this: V'halo yod Micah Amri. No, let's go to the next piece. The Gemara says, so there is a pasuk in the Megillah, the Chalal, chapter 9 of the Megillah. This is some part. This is chapter 8. Sorry, chapter 8 of the Megillah talks about the overturning of the decree. So Mordechai is now sending out new. The second updated decree to all the inhabitants of the empire of Achashverosh. So it says, the pasuk says that he sent. So there's a number of words there which are certainly not sort of regular Hebrew words and have Persian origin or other origins. But one of the words is that he sent out these scrolls, these letters, in those couriers riding on the horses, the Achashtronim, the sons of Ramachim. And the Gemara says, we don't know what Achashtronim b'nei Ramachim means. Those are not certainly not biblical Hebrew words. Actually, the word Remech does appear in the Mishnaic Hebrew, which we'll see later. But we don't know what those words mean, but yet we fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah, even though we don't know what those two words mean. So by the same token, one second, so what's the point of it? But nevertheless, there's a Persume Nitha. In other words, by everyone hearing the story together and hearing the reading of the Megillah, that emphasizes or promotes awareness of the miracle. So by the same token, even somebody who hears the Megillah and doesn't understand a single word, so also he's participating in the event, and there could be meaning, and Rashi says he could ask other people to tell him what it means. But you know what? We see from here that hearing the Megillah, even in Hebrew, even if you don't know what it means, you still fulfill the obligation.
Can you read along in English while hearing it?
Very important question. No, you cannot read along in English while hearing it because you can't hear two things simultaneously. Not only that, you cannot even read along in Hebrew while you're listening to it, unless you have your own kosher Megillah. If you have your own kosher Megillah and you are confident that you could say every word properly with the correct vowelization, etc., then you may, and perhaps even encouraged, to read it along with the Baal Korah. But if you're reading from a printed version, then that wouldn't work, and certainly not in another language. By the way, I should point out that it says here that you have. Oh, here we go. Yeah, look at. Let's read these psukim inside. So you Jews write as you see fit in the name of the king. And he says the scribes, they wrote on the 23rd day of Sivan, and it says he wrote in the name of the king of Achashverosh and sealed it with the king's ring, and he sent letter by the couriers on horseback. And now this version, which is I think I took this from Chabad.org, translated the riders of the king's steeds, the camels, bred by dromedaries. I don't even have any idea what that means, but those are the words. These last few words, Chashon and Bnei Hamachim, is what the words that the Gemara testifies that we don't know what they mean. We'll see soon that it's not so clear. Whatever. Now, I just want to point out one more thing, that besides if you were to read it according to this section clause in the Mishnah, that you could read it in another language. So obviously it would have to be written, but it would have to be written with ink and a parchment. And the Ritva says that it wouldn't have to have muk of gvil. In other words, that the requirement for each letter to be the exact precision of each letter wouldn't be as it is in Hebrew, but there would still be the requirement to have it written on parchment, and thing. However, there is a machlokes which Mishabura talks about, is which alphabet would we use? Would it be an English alphabet, or would it have to be written with the Hebrew alphabet? So would be ayin, nun, daled would be and then but still, even so, it would be a bit of a and the truth is, obviously the Arabic is a much closer related language to Hebrew than is English, but many of the Sfarim, all the Sfarim of the Jewish sages who wrote books in Arabic, the Rambam himself, the Rasag, dozens of sages who wrote books in Arabic, they all wrote them in Hebrew letters. It was very normal to write Arabic with Hebrew alphabet. Obviously, it would be much more confusing to write, a Latin-born language, or German. Yeah, to write German would be easier, but to write English or French or Spanish in Hebrew letters would be difficult. But it's certainly doable. Okay, let's see the Rambam. Okay, the Rambam says a person who reads the Megillah by heart does not fulfill his obligation. A person who speaks a language other than Hebrew and hears the Megillah read in Hebrew written in the Holy Scripture fulfills his obligation, or even though he doesn't understand what is being said. Similarly, if the Megillah was written in Greek, okay, well, we'll skip the Greek because that's not relevant nowadays. The Greek that the Mishnah talks about doesn't exist anymore. Okay. Targum. Okay, now here's the thing. So the Rambam paschals like that was in the Mishnah. If it was written in Aramaic or in another language of Gentile origin, one who listens to this reading fulfills his obligation only when he understands that language or when the Megillah is written in that language. Okay, so there's a big difference here, that anybody fulfills the obligation by hearing the Megillah written in Hebrew, even if you don't understand the word. But for English, you only fulfill the obligation if you understand that language and that it's written in that language. Yeah. Now, there is, however, a Yerushalmi. One second. The Yerushalmi says that somebody who what happens if somebody knows Hebrew and, let's say somebody who speaks Hebrew and English, can he fulfill his obligation in English? Now, the simple reading of the Mishnah doesn't suggest otherwise. If you understand English, you can fulfill the obligation in English. However, the Yerushalmi understands the Mishnah to be saying that you can only fulfill your obligation in English if you understand English exclusively. If you understand Hebrew and English, then you can't read the Megillah in English. Right? That then brings to another problem, which is interesting, because the Yerushalmi then says that if I understand Hebrew, not only can I not fulfill my obligation by hearing the Megillah in English, I can't read it for somebody else in English because there is a principle, and it's a very interesting application of this principle. There is a principle that you can only discharge somebody else their obligation for a mitzvah if I am obligated in that mitzvah. So, for example, a woman would not be able to blow shofar for men because men are obligated to hear shofar, and for women, hearing shofar is basically optional. So, in order for me to be able to do something and discharge somebody else their obligation, I have to have the equal degree of obligation that they have. So the Yerushalmi says that because I understand Hebrew, so I don't have the same obligation that so-and-so has who only understands English, and therefore I would not be able to read it for them. Now, it's like I said, it's an interesting application because you would think that, what do you mean? We both have the same mitzvah to hear the Megillah, so why am I not incorporating? And we could find other precedent for that, where two people have a different scenario of fulfilling the same mitzvah and they can overlap. But yet, that's what the Yerushalmi says. Now, it's important to note that Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, we paskin like the Babylonian Talmud. The Yerushalmi Talmud, certainly if there's a contradiction, and even not, we don't always incorporate the Yerushalmi Talmud into halacha, but this is the discussion, part of the discussion over here is going to be whether or not we paskin like this Yerushalmi, because if we're going to paskin like this Yerushalmi, then you could read the Megillah in English, but the Bal Korah would have to be somebody who doesn't understand Hebrew. And if you take into account that the opinion that it has to be written in Hebrew alphabet, you're going to be quite hard to find somebody who could read English written in Hebrew alphabet but doesn't understand Hebrew. But the Mishnah Berurah actually in the end leans to be mekel and says that it can be written even in the alphabet of whichever language it is. So you could, according to that, even according to Yerushalmi, if you had a Megillah which was successfully written in English, you could have a service of Megillah reading in, by English for English, and nobody who understands Hebrew is welcome.
When it says Hebrew, is the whole Megillah in Hebrew? You don't understand the entire Megillah, or nothing? You don't understand the thing?
So I don't think I understand the question.
You can only be yotze in English if you don't understand Hebrew. Does that mean you don't understand the entire Megillah? That means
you're saying even if you don't understand one word.
One word.
The way I understand it from the discussion that ensues is that at least the words that you understand, you would have to hear in Hebrew.
So if you understand Vayihi,
yes. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not.
How do you understand Vayihi if you're
most people understand some words. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. Now the Magen Mishnah says clearly that the Rambam disagrees with the. One second. The Magen Mishnah says clearly, the Magen Mishnah is the first, I think, commentary of the Rambam, and he says that the Rambam disagrees with the Yerushalmi, because the Rambam says that in order to understand, look at this, one who listens to this reading of another language fulfills his obligation only when he understands that language. Right? He doesn't say that only if you don't understand Hebrew. So the Rambam does not seem to be going with the Yerushalmi. However, the Magen Mishnah quotes that other important Rishonim, most notably we'll be speaking about the Ramban, Nachmanides. The Ramban does hold paskin like the Yerushalmi. We'll see in a minute. Now, I just want to point out before we go into the Ramban that the truth is, if you really want to be, you could read the Rambam otherwise, because the way the Hebrew reads over here is Ela hamakar oisa haloshim milvad, which this version translates as, right here we're seeing the challenge of translation over here, right? But he says only when you understand that language. But you could read it as if you understand that language exclusively, which would, if you were to read the Rambam like that, only somebody who understands that language exclusively, that would mean that if you understand Hebrew, you may not do the mitzvah in another language. So the Magen Mishnah says that the Rambam does not go with the Yerushalmi, but I'm just pointing out that those Rishonim who want to hold like the Yerushalmi, they could, at least b'doichak, pull the Rambam along with their opinion.
Why else would the word Bilvad be there? How was it interpreted?
Either Hamakar Yisrael Lashon Bilvad, that only somebody who understands that language, which is the way
We
they
just say, Allah, Makar, Lashon. Why do you have to add the word Bilvad? Without the word Bilvad, it's perfect.
I think that's not search the word Bilvad in the Rambam, you'll see that's how the Rambam uses the word.
Not exclusive.
Yeah, it doesn't have to know. Certainly, the way the English over here have translated it is certainly the Pashut Pshat in the Rambam, and that's what the Maggid Mishnah says. The Maggid Mishnah says that's the Pshat in the Rambam. Now here's an interesting thing. Now we have to remember the names over here. So we have the Ran. The Ran is Rabbeinu Nissim. I put his thing in a bit later, but Rabbeinu Nissim of Gerona. He's going to be a prominent player in this whole story. But so he wrote a commentary on the Rif, and he quotes the Ramban, which says that we have to follow the Yerushalmi, and the Ran himself actually asks a number of questions on the Ramban. And he says that he doesn't, he gets in, it's a very extensive, detailed discussion, but his bottom line is that the Ran rules. He says, I'm not convinced at all by the Ramban that we need to follow the Yerushalmi in this instance, but I'm not convinced, but it couldn't hurt. So we should behave in accordance with the Ramban, namely that you can only fulfill the obligation in another language if you do not understand Hebrew. If you do understand Hebrew, you cannot understand, you write in another language, and by the same token, if you don't understand Hebrew, you cannot read it for somebody else in another language. Now here we come to the Tshuva of the Rivash. So the Rivash, 1 second. Okay, the Rivash is Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshes, who was, here you go, this is an important part, he was a student of the Ran. This same Ran who has just told us that even though he's not convinced by the Ramban, but we ought to be machmir like the Ramban anyway. So he had a student called the Rivash. The Rivash became, for a number of years, he became the Rav in a city called Saragossa. Saragossa is a city in Spain. In the language of the Rishonim, they call it Sarcosta. And in the response of the Rivash in Siman Shin Peches, chapter 308, response number 388, he writes like this: "This is the letter which I sent to my teacher, the Ran, as soon as I came to Sarcosta. Concerning reading the Megillah, written in Laz. Laz means the foreign language, which in his case was whatever the precursor to Spanish, in Spanish. And he starts off with a long introduction of his words of affection and love to the Ran. And then he says that I see that there's many customs in this community of Saragossa, which they're always being lenient. And that's the style of here. They're always, whenever there's two opinion, they always have their leniencies. Now, some of the things that they're lenient about, he says, they have on who to rely on. And he quotes the famous machlokes about Hatzmona, that they pass like Reb Haigon, which is a lenient opinion. But some of the things that they're lenient about, I don't see any basis for their lenient way of doing things. And so now, before Purim, they told me that it's already 30 years that the custom here in Saragossa is that they read the Megillah for the women in Laz, in Spanish, and written in Spanish. And I told them that this is not okay. Why is it not okay? Because like we just saw from the Ramban and the Yerushalmi, that it's not okay for somebody who does understand Hebrew, and in this case the Baal Koreh understands Hebrew. So even if all the women in Saragossa only know Spanish, but the Baal Koreh knows Hebrew, so that's not good enough. How could he do your mitzvah for you in Spanish? And they've been doing this for 30 years. And he says, Rabbi Anoidul da Talusa. Rabbi Anoidul da Talusa is the Maggid Mishnah, who's only known to us by his Spanish name. Interesting. And he says even the Maggid Mishnah, who, like we said before, he attributes the Rambam to be here and sends Rambam to be disagreeing with the Yerushalmi, but he himself, quoting the Ramban and the Rashba and the Yerushalmi, the Maggid Mishnah himself says that we should be machmir like the Yerushalmi. And then he says that there is my colleague over here, Hachacham Hanichbad, Rabbi Yosef ibn David. Now, Rabbi Yosef ibn David was also a Talmud of the Ran, so they were somewhat they were contemporaries of both. Came from the school of the Ran, of the Ran, the Rivash and his contemporary, and they were colleagues. And we find many things that they did. It's interesting. So this Rabbi Yosef and the Rivash, they had many differences, very strong differences, to the extent that it seems that at the end of the day, that's why the Rivash left Saragossa, because it was just too much to kept them being too much discord. But nevertheless, they cooperated very nicely together, and we find historical records of numerous projects that they supported each other on and worked together with. So a very interesting relationship. So he says that this colleague of mine, who's also your student, Rabbi Yosef ibn David, he supports them in all of their lenient customs, whether it's lahachnifam, just to flatter them, so that he find favor in their eyes, or whether it's just to embarrass me, or whether he just likes to get his own cover, his own glory, or maybe because he's just too weak to do anything about it, or maybe all of these four reasons are true. I don't know why, but for some reason, this Rabbi Yosef ibn David is supportive of them. And there's another elderly rabbi over here called Don Ezra, who also tells them not to change. They've been doing this for so many years. And he said like this, this is a funny one. The Ramban, we said already before, the Ramban says not to do it, because the Ramban says you have to do with the Yerushalmi. But in the Ramban's discussion of not doing it, he says, many people do this, but it's a mistake, then I shouldn't be doing it because of the Yerushalmi. So the people of Saragossa say to the Rivash, you see, the Ramban already testifies that many people are doing this. The Ramban himself says that they shouldn't be doing it because of a mistake. Okay, whatever. We say that many people have been doing this, and we should keep the custom, right? So the people of Saragossa in general have a tendency to leniency, and specifically here they have this custom which we can verify. We have testimony that this has been the case for so many years, and therefore, we have precedent. Now, it's one of the things that's really interesting is that he starts off this shuvah by saying that some of the lenient customs have no basis. He says some of the lenient customs have basis, like they're relying on Rav Haigain about Hatmana. Okay, but some of them have no basis. For example, reading the Megillah in Spanish. What do you mean it has no basis? Now, you could say that it's wrong for you to rely on the lenient opinion, and we should be stringent like the opinion of the Ramban. But it's strange that he says there's no basis. Of course, there's basis. The Ramban, those who argue on the Ramban, the simple reading of the Rambam, right? But the Rivash seems to be convinced that there is no legitimate. The Rivash seems to be convinced that there is no legitimate. There is no legitimate basis to have somebody who does understand Hebrew read the Megillah in Spanish. And then he says that even if you are right, that it's okay for someone who understands Hebrew to read the Megillah in Spanish, but what are you going to do about the accuracy of your translation? And he says, for example, you translate these words of Achashtronim b'nei Haramochim as somebody here speaks Spanish. Okay, so you'll be able to read these words for me as they are pronounced in Spanish. Okay, the Spanish also has developed over the years, but I have here the way it's. Here we go. Let's move my screen out of the way. He says they translate. One second. What was this? In their Megillah that they read for the women in Spanish, they have translated the words. 1 second. They have translated the words of Achashrodim b'nei Haramochim, and this is how he writes it in Hebrew: Los potros pigush de los iguas, which in modern day Spanish, this is what it is. Los potros. Read this.
Los, what? Are you saying cuatros?
No, it's potros.
Potros?
Los potros.
Don't know that word.
No, I'm not saying what it means. Tell me how you pronounce it. How do you?
Potros. See?
Yeah, go and read this sentence. Los potros.
See?
And what's this word? How do you read this word in Spanish? Again?
Hijos.
Hijos
Children.
de los yeguas. Okay, los potros, hijos de los yeguas, which means the fowls, the sons of the mares. Now, what's a fowl? What's a mare? So a fowl is a young horse. So the word potros, this is going to be important. The word potros means a young horse. And these horses are the sons of the mare, which means a mature female horse. So they've translated as a chashranim b'nei haramachim to mean the young horses that Mordechai was sending his courier services, and they were riding young horses, the sons of female horses. Well, we have a strange translation because obviously young horses are sons of female horses, but that's their translation. Says the Rivash, I don't understand. The Gemara says that we don't know what Achashtanim b'nei haramachim means. So how could you claim? So true, the Mishnah says that you could read the Megillah in a foreign language, and even if we're going to accept your thing that you can read it in a foreign language, even if you understand Hebrew, but it's all theoretical because in practice we can't translate the words. The Gemara testifies that we don't know what that words mean. Man salik leila, who went up on high and told you that this is what those words mean? And if you don't have those words right, then the whole thing is lost.
Can you transliterate those?
Yeah. Okay. This is the tshuva of the Rivash. This is the letter that the Rivash sends to the Ran. Now, that was Rivash chapter letter number 388. 2 chapters later, in 390, the Rivash records the letter that he got back from the Ran. And the Ran absolutely gives his full support for the Rivash in objecting to the custom. Now, interesting, before he gets into the details of the Megillah, he gives him a general hashkafa in life. And if you recall, in the letter of the Rivash to the Ran, he said to him that over here in Saragossa, in Sarkosta, they're always lenient about everything, right? And they have this Rabbi Yosef ibn David who's always supportive of their lenient things. So then he says, I want to tell you that even when it comes to worldly matters, any smart person, called Maskir, you always take the path of least risk. And you make sure to avoid risky situations, even if it's a very small chance. What are the chances that you're going to get hurt if you don't wear a seatbelt? But you wear a seatbelt if your wife's in the car. Certainly, listen to this. How much more so that we should do so with the ways of Torah and mitzvahs, which are kivshoyne shalolim, which are sort of so central to the world. And how can we abandon the way which our ancestors treaded in and put ourselves into a very narrow path without any desperate need? If there's a desperate need to be lenient and to do things differently than our ancestors did, then fine. But so if it would be really necessary for them to read the Megillah in Spanish, no, I'll let them get away with it. But what's so difficult for them to just do the way we've always been doing it? For already centuries, we have the history of reading the Megillah in Hebrew for everyone, even for those who don't understand Hebrew. So why are we trying to change it? To abandon the way which is certainly okay and to adopt a way which has doubt, you wouldn't do that in any other of your personal or worldly affairs. So why should you do that in the way of mitzvahs? And therefore, I don't agree with the people who are allowing to read the Megillah in Spanish because of this translation of Achashtarim b'nei haramachim. And he says, I tried very hard to try and justify their minhag, and I can't do it. Now, here's the important thing. There's two primary issues that the Rivash raises over here. One is it legitimate for somebody who does understand Hebrew to read the Megillah in another language? And the other is, do we have an accurate translation of Achashtarim b'nei haramachim? Now, the Ran, if you recall in his commentary to the Rif, he said clearly that even though he's not so convinced by the arguments of the Ramban, but we should be machmir. And the same too in this tshuva. He's very, like, he goes through all the details of the different Gemaras which prove one way or the other. And he's not convinced by the Ramban's argument, but he still maintains that the Ramban says we should be machmir, we should go with the Yerushalmi that says that only if you don't understand Hebrew can you read it in another language, and therefore that's what we ought to do. So it's like, if you read between the lines, it's like he's supporting the Rivash and saying you have to be machmir, but he's not really, he's like, yeah, we ought to be machmir like the Ramban, but he's not really convinced of the Ramban's arguments as they sort of the various proofs from the sugya point to. And then he gets onto this translation of Achashtonim b'nei Aramachim. And he says, well, the Gemara says we don't know what Achashtonim b'nei Aramachim means, but it could be that the Gemara doesn't mean to say that nobody knows what it means, right? It could mean the Gemara means to say that these are difficult words that most people don't know. Doesn't mean that nobody knows what it means. And it's possible to say that we do have tradition as to what these words actually mean. So maybe this translation that the people of Saragossa are using, Los Potros Hijos de los Yaguas, this word, the fowl, what?
Yeah,
The fowls, the sons of the mares, maybe that is an accurate translation. Now he says, I looked at the commentaries of this pasuk, and he doesn't actually name the Ibn Ezra, but he says the Rans, they go a little bit of the. Sometimes you actually see the Ramban being called Ranbar, right? Reb Nissen ben Ruvain. We call him usually just the Ran, or sometimes he's referred to as the Ran of Grona. Okay, so he says that the commentaries say, and he anonymously quotes the Ibn Ezra, that Achashtronim means Perodim. Perodim means a pered is a mule, and Ramachim means female horses, and so it is in Arabic, which the etymology of Arabic, the structure of Arabic is very similar to that of Hebrew, and he says a mule. Now a mule means an offspring of a camel and a horse. Sorry, a donkey and a horse. Donkey and a horse. Now, it could be either way. You could have the father being a donkey, you could have the mother being a donkey. But he says that the mares, the mules that have the mother being a horse versus the father being a horse are stronger, right? And it's interesting that just on my first Google, the definition of mule, it says the sterile offspring of a female horse and a male donkey valued as an animal work having strong muscles, right? So somehow the fact of the mother being a horse makes the animal stronger. Now, having strong horses was very important over here, as we'll see soon. The idea was to get these letters across the entire empire of Persia at top speed. So they were looking for the fastest animal that the writer could sit on and carrying copies of these letters, right? So this interpretation of the Ibn Ezra that we're talking here about mules, which are the sons of mares, and also now it's suddenly like when you say if Achashtronim means what did we say it was? Fowls, yeah, young horses. Then young horses, sons of female horses. That's a very strange phrase. But if it means mules, the sons of mares, now that makes a lot more sense. So he says. The Ram says, I was still trying to justify the Saragosian custom, and I asked people who are experts in this language, is it possible for that word potros to mean mules? And they said no. Potros means exclusively young horses. And so basically, okay, so that's it. So basically, now again, so the Ran is coming out in support of the Rivash, but there's a couple of not problems, but again, he's not convinced of the argument that somebody who understands Hebrew can't read it in Spanish. He just says it's better to do that. And even here, he says, okay, well, that translation is wrong. Okay, so then just change the translation. Instead of saying fowls the sons of mares, say mules the sons of mares, and you're good to go. The Ran doesn't say that. The Ran just says that because that translation is wrong, so therefore you can't do it. Now, what else? The truth is like this. So you have it. Rashi actually says, you saw before from the Chabad.org, they translated. I didn't understand all the words they used, but they translated Achashronim as camels, which is what Rashi says. In Rashi's commentary to Megillah Esther, he says that Achashronim means camels. There's also other versions of translations we find. We find some commentaries saying that Achashronim means that Roich ve'Harachesh, the riders of the, no, he sent them biyad rotzim basusim, sent them like couriers on horseback. Roich ve'Harachesh, the riders of the king. So is Achashronim b'nei Ramachim another thing, or is it just a synonym for the words we've just said, Roich ve'Harachesh? So some argue that Achashronim is just a synonym, and it's a Persian word that means royal agent. So it's not a camel or a horse or a mare or a fowl, it's just a royal agent. There's also actually a Mishnah. We do find, I thought I put this down in my source sheet here. We do find the word rechesh in the Mishnah. 1 second. There is a Mishnah where we find the rechesh in the context of a Mishnah in Kilayim, where it's clear that rechesh means a female horse. So, something like remech means a female horse. Now, there is an article that I have here, an academic article by all about the sort of the history from various different Bibles, ancient translations of the Bibles, to what these words mean. And actually, I mean, he goes through what he says. You do find indeed Bibles that have the translation of the Ramban. So he says there's an old ancient Bible that says Los Mulos de las Yeguas, Fijos de las Yeguas, right? The mules, the sons of the thing. So this translation that the Ramban is quoting, that we see also here, is he seems to be quoting the Ibn Ezra. Indeed, there are very ancient Bibles translated into Spanish that have this translation. Then he says, you see, there's another Bible that translates it as, no, this is, right. He translates, he brings another ancient Bible that just has this word in Spanish, which means horseman, but he doesn't, so he skips it. I mean, this is part of the trouble of translation when you're talking about synonyms. If you hold that rechesh b'nei Ramachim is a synonym of reich ve'harechesh, so then he just skips those words. So he just has the horseman reich ve'harechesh, translated as horseman, and then he skips the next few words. So then he obviously holds that they are just synonyms. But it's interesting that in this article, he does find a lot of precedent, very ancient precedent from, again, there's going to various different, very ancient manuscripts, where what was in support of the translation to which the Ravash and the Ran were opposed, that it Los Potros, right? That it means the fowls, the sons of mares. So again, even though it's difficult to understand, like, why are you telling us that these were young horses, the sons of female horses, that thing. But so even though logically it's difficult to understand, but nevertheless, there is tremendous sort of historical record to that. And then at the end, he actually says something funny, that he found a translation in one of the manuscripts which translated it as elephants, which would be a very strange translation also in the context, because if you're trying to get things very fast across the thing, then elephants is not really the way to go. But he says that he thinks that it's a mistake, that it said al-kil, which means which is one of the which means the, I forget if al-kil is the mule or the potra, whatever, one of those words. But the kof of kil, you have the letter kof, is very similar to a pei, which is al-pil, and pil, even in modern Hebrew, is an elephant. It's probably related actually to the English word elephant. You have those same, the al and the pei in there. So he says that was just a sort of typo that developed into it, meaning elephants. But one of the very interesting sources that he quotes is the Manis Halevi. The Manis Halevi is a commentary on the Megillah Esther from Reb Shlomo Alkovitz. Reb Shlomo Alkovitz is most famous to us as being the author of L'Chadoidi that we sing on Friday night, and he has the Manis Halevi is the name of his commentary on the Megillah Esther. And his Manis Halevi, he quotes. It's not. He's quoting there from somebody by the name of Reb Yehuda ibn Shushan. I'm not sure who that is. He says, "Hamafarshim hiskimu." The commentaries have agreed, "Shem oile hasusim," that it means young horses, the sons of female horses, which in our language is called potros, the sons of yeguas. Right. So that again, the Manis Halevi is saying that all the commentaries agree to the translation of Saragossa, which the Ran and the Rivash were opposed to, that it means potros, not that it means fowls, not that it means mules. Now. The truth is that l'chayra, if that's the issue, it's a very easy issue to overcome. And now we get to sort of the classic halachic texts, right? So the Beis Yosef, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and before he got to his Shulchan Aruch, he, in his commentary to the Torah, which is more of sort of an overview of the halacha before it's getting into very concise code, he quotes this whole issue with the correct, what's the correct translation, and he says even if we knew the translation, we ought to be machmir like the Ramban, that somebody who understands Hebrew can't read it in another language. But he says, I don't understand. Even if we can't determine the translation of the patra I don't understand. What's the problem? Why don't you just read the whole Megillah in Laz, in Spanish, and whatever the local tongue is, right? And when you get to those words, you say them in Hebrew. You don't know what they mean in Spanish? We know that if you don't understand Hebrew, you can fulfill. So those words, have them written in your scroll in Hebrew, and read them in Hebrew. What's the problem? And we don't find anywhere that you can't read the Megillah in two languages. So what's the problem? And either you write them in Hebrew, or you write them in Spanish, or you read them, because if you read, we said in the beginning, if you read the Megillah by heart, it's no good, but it's not every word. If you read a few words out about Peh, it's okay. So he sort of doesn't understand the problem, but then we have the problem with the Ramban, that if somebody doesn't understand Hebrew, he leaves it at that. Now, what does he say in Shulchan Aruch? In Shulchan Aruch, which is the sort of the code where he tells you what you have to do, he says, somebody who understands the foreign language and also understands Hebrew does not fulfill his obligation in last. So, whereas until now we've been saying that we ought to be machmir like the Ramban, and Shulchan Aruch, he sort of says it sort of authoritatively. You're not yotze if you do it in another language. But yeah, show him that he says, "Oh, there's another opinion that you are yotze."
They still don't know what the word means in Hebrew.
Yeah, but 1 second. So there's two. So 1 second. And then he says, "V'yesh limchos." We have to reprimand. We have to object, protest. You have to protest those who read the Megillah for the women in the local tongue, even if it's written in the local tongue. Now, why do we ought to protest? So you have two classical commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, the Taz and the Magen Avraham. The Taz says that the reason we ought to protest is, and he quotes that line from the Ran that says, "Why should you abandon the safe way of our ancestors and go into something which is not thing?" And the Magen Avraham says the reason why you have to protest is because we don't know the translation of Achashtronim b'nei Haramachim. I just read it in Hebrew. Says the Magen Avraham, no, you're not yotze if you read it in two languages. How do you know you're not yotze if you read it in two languages? Because otherwise the Ran should have said just read it in Hebrew. It's almost circular, right? Just the Magen Avraham is basically deducing from the fact that all these people who discussed it never suggested to read it in two languages, right? Until the Beis Yosef, who sort of didn't really get into it. Okay, so it must be that it's not good enough to read it in two languages. So now we're stuck. We don't know the accurate translation of Achashtronim b'nei Haramachim, and we can't read it in two languages. So So what's the problem? That's why you can't do it. You can't do it. Now the truth is, 1 second. So sorry, what did you just ask, Bob?
Well, my thing is that no one who reads the Megillah knows what it completely means all.
Right,
Because no one knows what the word
but like the Gemara, that's the Gemara said. The Gemara says that if you're in Hebrew, even if you don't understand it, you go to the mitzvah. So if I hear the Megillah in Hebrew and I have no idea what Achashtranim B'nei Ramach means, or for that matter, I have no idea what any of it means, I'm going to the mitzvah. But if I'm reading in a foreign language, then I must understand that language, and according to the Rambam, I must understand that language exclusively and not understand Hebrew, right? So if I don't know what Achashtranim B'nei Ramach means, if I read it in Hebrew, it's fine. I don't know what it means, but it's fine. But here we're not sure if it means the mules or if it means the fowls. Right. So what are you going to do? You can't read it in 2 languages. Apparently, we don't know why, but apparently you can't read it in 2 languages. And we don't know what the right translation is, so you're stuck. So
I'm just thinking that no one knows.
Again, yeah, it's true that no one knows, but even if no one knows, if you hear it in Hebrew, it's fine.
Right.
Now,
I understand.
however, so even though the Magen Avraham sort of says this blanket statement that it's forbidden to read it in 2 languages, so garnish azoi pashat, as they say, it's not so simple. The Pri Chadash says no. Like, why can't you do it in 2 languages? No reason why not to. The Pri Megadim says, well, you're not allowed to do it in 2 languages. Now, all of this is very strange because, first of all, especially nowadays, where to hear the Megillah for 45 minutes, especially for people who didn't grow up who didn't grow up doing it, and for people who it's a complete, So one of the most you can expect from them is to sit and simultaneously read it, not verbalizing the words, but read it with their eyes in English, which also, so you're not really paying attention. You're reading a book and there's background noise.
Right, so that doesn't count as.
So wouldn't it be so much better if we just read the Megillah in English? Not only that, the Pri Megadim and the Pri Chadash Magen Avraham are all busy with, can you read the Megillah in 2 languages? I have a much better idea. Read it all in 1 language and say all the possible translations. We already said that if you say a few words, Shalom mitoich haksav, if you say a few words not out of the text, by heart, it's okay. You're not allowed to read the whole thing in heart, but a few words here or there is fine. And we actually do that because there are certain words in the Megillah which there's different traditions as to what the correct word is. And certainly a Chabad custom is that we do both. For example, v'ish lo yomad bifneihem, which is what it says in the Megillah, nobody stood in their way. So is it nobody stood bifneihem or nobody stood lifneihem? So in the actual Megillah, obviously it only says one of those 2 ways, but in practice we read both. And if the correct one is lifneihem, then we read that word by heart. Okay, right? And similarly, there's another one, laharoigu la'abit v'laharoigu la'abit. Right? So, okay, so you don't know if it means the mules or if it means, you don't know if it means, you don't know if Achashtranim means mules or if it means royal agents or if it means, fine, so just say all of them. It'll still be much more meaningful to people than reading it in Hebrew. You don't want to mix languages, you want to have it all in English. Okay, have it all in English and say all the possible variations of what it might mean. Might sound a bit repetitive, but okay. Anyway, now the Magen Avraham also quotes the Tshuva of the Ranach, which is Rabbi Leo ben Chaim, who lived, I put here, I think in the footnote. Yeah, he was born in Adrianople, which at the time was Turkey, in the year 1530. So he's the Rivash was in the earlier discussion of the Rivash in Iran is earlier. They lived. What years did the Rivash in Iran live? We had this on the screen before. Didn't really pay attention. The Rivash was in the 14th century, and this is already a little bit later. Oh, here we go. I had that mentioned to you before. The Mishnah in Kilayim. It's a Mishnah in Kilayim, chapter 8, Mishnah 5, where it says where Ramach clearly means the female's horse. Okay, anyway. So basically the Ranach records this very strange custom. Now, so what day is Purim? Purim is on the 14th, and in those cities that had a wall at the time of Yeshua ben Nun, it's on the 15th. So there are a number of cities where it's a doubt. We don't know whether or not they had a wall, and so they do 2 days. So he says there's a certain city. Does he say which city it was? Sounds like he's talking in Turkey. It's interesting because in Turkey, I know certainly in Istanbul today, the custom is they do 2 days of Purim because that was always the minhag, even though the minhag started from a place of ignorance and history, meaning in those days they saw the city has a wall, so maybe this wall is around for thousands of years, we don't know. But by now we know with certainty that Istanbul did not have a wall around it in the time of Yeshua ben Nun. But nevertheless, because the custom always was that in Istanbul they do 2 days Purim, so they still do it today. But basically, the minhag was that on the second day Purim, instead of reading the Megillah, they would read some story that they had, where they had the whole story of the Megillah, including the midrashim and all the different things, in Spanish or whatever, in not Spanish, in whatever the language was over there. And how did this come to be? Anyway, basically, it turns out that it was. They used to do this when it fell on Shabbos, like it does this year. So anyway, you don't read the Megillah, so they did that instead. And then people started thinking that you have to do that. Reading the story is more important than reading the Megillah. Whatever, just an interesting thing that Magen Avraham also quotes. The bottom line is like this: that I think that there's 2 reasons why, in practice, this never sort of kicked off. Number one is that it is, I don't know that it's insurmountable, but it is difficult to get an accurate translation of the Megillah written in English that is going to sort of suffice all opinions, and it's going to be that's going to be tough. But the other thing is that as the last couple of centuries have sort of given birth to all sorts of offshoots of Judaism, so Torah true Judaism, which became known as Orthodoxy, has become very suspicious and cautious about anything that could be seen that way. And there's actually a letter from Rabbi Akiva Eiger, where he says people want to daven in English, not in English, he's talking about German, yeah? But people want to daven in thing, and he says, it's impossible, how could you translation? And he goes on for a long time to speak about the challenge of translation and how you're changing around. He says, first of all, you're changing around the order of words. He says, look, take this sentence, translate it into German, and then take that German translation and translate it back into Hebrew. You're going to come out with something else. And he says you have, for example, one of the examples he gives is V'hoyam Shemaya Tishmu, which is a double expression in Hebrew, which has no translation into English. So he doesn't like this whole thing of translating anything into English. And he's very, very, now the truth is that even nowadays, so the Alter Rebbe paskins clearly that you can daven in English, and certainly if you don't understand Hebrew. But there's another thing, that even nowadays, and we do support and even encourage people who don't understand Hebrew to daven in English, but you'll never find the minyan in English right? The Chazan is always going to be reading in Hebrew, right? Now, technically speaking, there's no reason why not, right? If we say that this English translation is valid and you fulfill your obligation of davening by saying English, so then why shouldn't everybody say it in English? But we don't, and there seems to be a pushback against, the very early stages of the reform movement. There's actually a letter which I once saw. I didn't see it recently, so I hope I'm quoting it accurately. Where somebody asked the Rebbe about reading the Ksubah in English under the chuppah, and
I'm a little surprised you didn't stop class to do this.
Me too.
And where was I? So somebody asked the Rebbe about reading the Ksubah in English under the chuppah, so like people should understand what it's about. It's nice. And until today, and you'll see, like in the Chabad house, a chuppah where there's crowds who are not sort of all familiar, you'll have like an MC who tells you what's going on, right? And the Rebbe said, like in theory, it's a good idea, but we have to be very careful about changing anything about the rituals that are done under the chuppah because we need to keep that pristine. And there's actually a shuvah from a contemporary Rav, who says that the reason we can't do it in English is because that's going to basically feed into reform. Now, it seems like a combination of those two factors: the difficulty in execution of getting an accurate translation in English, as well as our general sort of caution when it comes to the liturgy or any rituals of changing anything, is the reason we don't do it. Now, before we finish, I just want to share with you, I want to read this together with you. So there's a man by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Landi who wrote a very interesting book on the book of Yirmiyah, actually, first. So he has a lot of stuff in Hebrew, but in English he has two books. We have them both in the library. One is archaeological stuff that has to do with the book of Yirmiyah, fascinating book. Then he has one on the Persian Empire as well, which is a very interesting book. I personally found the one on Yirmiyah much more interesting, but he describes what these, whatever they are, whether they're mares or mule or whatever it is, he describes what it was all about. The Megillah mentions that the king's new decree was sent up by swift riders. The Persians had developed a system that enabled them to transport the king's decrees in record time. The system included a highly developed network of roads, as well as skilled riders who could ride swift horses. One famous road was called the Royal Road and connected the capital city of Shushan with the city of Sardis in ancient Lydia, modern-day Turkey, which was at the edge of the empire. I guess Herodotus, who's I guess the historian, which he's referring to, describes the course of this road in detail and mentions how much time it would take for an average person to travel each segment of the road. In total, it should have taken 90 days to travel from Shushan to Sardis. However, the high-speed riders were able to cover this distance in record time. Herodotus' praise for this system actually served as inspiration for the United States Postal Service many years later. He writes, "There's nothing in the world which travels faster than these Persian couriers. It is said that men and horses are stationed along the road equal in number to the number of the days the journey takes, a man and a horse for each day." So they would sort of ride at top speed, and once the horse was wearing out, there was already another horse waiting at that stage to take over, so they were able to go at record speed for the entire way. Then he goes on to discuss, different records of different stamps of the, food rations and stuff that were taken along this highway. And then also he has here a picture. This is existing remains of the Royal Road, which I guess we would call today the highway, which connected Shushan to Sardis, which was used by the King's swift riders. So this is a actual picture of the road on which the Megillah talks about these riders taking the letters of Mordechai to all the edges of the empire. This is one of the highways that those horses took. And with that, we bring this to a close.
Yeah, that's the Pony Express.
The Pony Express. How do I stop the recording? Stop recording.